Scotland's most famous football club, 140 years old, loved by millions, liquidated over a tax scheme. Not relegated, not humbled, killed. Picture it. A club older than the light bulb in your ceiling, older than the telephone. A club that had lifted more league titles than any team on the face of the earth. A stadium built to hold the roar of 50,000 souls. A cathedral of red brick and marble where fathers had stood with sons for over a century, where grief and joy and faith all wore the same colours. This was not a football team. This was an inheritance, a thing you were born into and buried in. And then, one grey Glasgow morning in 2012, it was gone. The company that had been Rangers Football Club since 1872, since before cars, before flight, before the lights came on across Britain, was wound up like a failed corner shop. Its assets stripped, its name dragged from the summit of Scottish football down into the mud at the very bottom. Grown men who had never cried at a funeral wept in the streets outside the stadium. Because something they believed was eternal had just been handed a death certificate. How? How do you kill a giant that outlived 2 world wars, that watched empires rise and crumble, that survived everything history could throw at it, only to be brought down not by a rival, not by a war, but by a piece of paper, a clever little tax trick that was supposed to make them richer? Stay with me. Because the weapon that killed Rangers wasn't a bomb or a bankruptcy or a betrayal from outside. It was a shortcut, a loophole they chose, a deal that looked like genius for 10 glorious years. Right up until the morning it looked like a grave. This is the story of how a club that was certain it was too big to fall, fell anyway, and how the smartest men in the room never saw it coming. To understand the shock, you have to understand the size. Rangers weren't a big club, they were the big club. Founded in 1872 by a handful of teenage boys with a dream of starting a football team. By the 20th century, that dream had become an institution. 54 league titles, more domestic trophies than almost any club in the history of the sport. In 1972, they won a European trophy, beating the mighty Dynamo Moscow. Their home, Ibrox Stadium, was a cathedral of red brick and marble, a place woven into the identity of a city, of a country, of a faith. Half of Glasgow lived and died by this club. Fathers passed it to sons like a family name. On match day, tens of thousands would pour through the turnstiles, and the sound they made could be heard streets away. Rangers were permanence itself, the kind of thing you assumed would still be there long after you were gone. You did not imagine a world without them any more than you imagined a world without the moon. And that is exactly what makes this story so hard to believe. Because giants like this aren't supposed to die. They're supposed to have bad seasons. Sack a manager, rebuild. They are not supposed to vanish. So how do you kill something this size? You don't do it from the outside, you do it from within. And it starts, as these stories so often do, with temptation. Here's where our story really begins. To win, you need the best players. And the best players cost money. Enormous money. Wages that would make your head spin. Now imagine someone walks into the boardroom and says, "What if I could pay your stars huge sums, and you barely had to pay any tax on it? What if there was a way to hand a player 2, 3, 4 million pounds and tell the taxman almost none of it counted as wages?" That, in plain English, is what an employee benefit trust was, an EBT. Stay with me, because this is the beating heart of the whole tragedy, and it's simpler than it sounds. Normally, when a club pays a player, that's a salary, and salary gets taxed heavily. But Rangers, under owner Sir David Murray, used a different route. Instead of paying part of a player's money as a wage, they paid it into a trust. And from that trust, the player received a loan. A loan, money he was never really expected to pay back. On paper it wasn't income, it was a friendly loan from a trust fund, and loans, unlike wages, don't get taxed. Think about what that means. You could offer a superstar a fortune, but because a big chunk of it was dressed up as a loan, you saved a mountain of tax on it, which meant you could offer players more than clubs your own size could afford. You could punch above your weight, you could buy dreams on a discount. Over roughly a decade, Rangers funneled tens of millions of pounds to players and staff through these trusts. It was, on the surface, brilliant, a loophole, a magic trick. Everyone else was paying full price, and Rangers had found the club shop discount code for glory. But here's the thing about a Faustian bargain. The devil always comes to collect. The only question is when. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Because with that extra spending power, Rangers didn't just compete, they dominated. Big names arrived, internationals. Players who, by the ordinary maths of a Scottish club's budget, maybe shouldn't have been affordable at all. The trophies came rolling in, league titles stacked up. Rivals looked on and wondered how on earth Rangers kept doing it, kept signing these players, kept winning. The fans were in heaven. And why wouldn't they be? Their club looked untouchable. Every silver trophy lifted into the Glasgow sky was proof that Rangers were exactly what they'd always believed. The biggest, the best, the forever club. Sir David Murray, the owner, was hailed as a visionary, a man who'd taken a great club and made it greater. But look closely at that word, illusion, because the dominance was real on the pitch and hollow underneath it. The trophies were being paid for, in part, with a scheme that hadn't yet been tested, a bill that hadn't yet arrived. Rangers were living in a beautiful house built on a fault line, and nobody in the stands could feel the ground beginning to move. Here's a question to sit with. What's worse, never reaching the top, or reaching it, standing there in the sunlight, and not knowing the floor beneath your feet is already cracking? Because it was. And the cracks were about to become a chasm. The taxmen, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC, had started asking questions, uncomfortable questions. They looked at those trusts, at those loans that never got repaid, and they said what a lot of people had quietly suspected. That's not a loan, that's a wage. And if it's a wage, then you owe us tax on all of it, years of it, with interest, with penalties. The number they eventually reached for was staggering. Tens of millions of pounds. For a football club, that's not a fine, that's an extinction level event. This became known across Scotland as the big tax case, and the whole nation began to watch. Now here's where it gets worse, because Sir David Murray, the long-term owner, could see the storm coming, and in May 2011 he sold the club. Not for a fortune, not for the hundreds of millions you might expect. He sold Rangers Football Club, a 139-year-old institution, for £1. One single pound. Read that again. One of the most famous football clubs on earth changed hands for less than the price of a chocolate bar. Why? Because whoever bought it wasn't really buying the trophies. They were buying the debts, and the man who stepped forward to buy it was a little-known businessman named Craig White. White arrived promising investment, promising to clear the debt, to back the manager, to steady the ship. The fans, desperate for a saviour, wanted to believe him. But behind the scenes, something far darker was happening. To buy the club, White had borrowed money against the club's own future, specifically against millions of pounds of season ticket income that hadn't even been sold yet. He'd mortgaged the fans' own loyalty to fund his takeover. And worse, far worse, while all this was going on, the club stopped handing over the tax it was collecting from ordinary staff wages, the regular tax, the VAT, the everyday money that any business simply must pay. So now you had a club drowning under one colossal tax case from the past, while quietly failing to pay its ordinary taxes in the present. It was like a man ignoring a bank foreclosure, while also refusing to pay his electricity bill. And HMRC, already circling over the big case, now had a fresh, undeniable immediate reason to strike. The end, when it came fast. On the 14th of February 2012, Valentine's Day, of all days, Rangers Football Club entered administration. Administration is what happens when a company can no longer pay its debts and effectively surrenders control to insolvency experts who try to save whatever can be saved. The moment it happened, the football authorities hit Rangers with an immediate 10-point deduction, ending any hope of the title that season, and for the fans, the disbelief was total. This was Rangers. Grown men wept outside Ibrox. The club that was supposed to be eternal was now in the hands of administrators, its survival suddenly, genuinely, in question. Players left, money vanished. And the administrators looked at the books and found a horror show. Debts owed everywhere, to the taxman, to other clubs, to small businesses who'd simply supplied the club and now might never be paid. There was one last hope. A deal called a CVA, a company voluntary arrangement, where the creditors, the people owed money, agree to accept a fraction of what they're owed so the company can survive. It was the lifeline, the single fraying thread the whole club was hanging by, and for weeks the fans prayed to it. They bought season tickets they weren't sure would mean anything. They sang louder, as if volume alone could keep the lights on. Now, before I tell you what happened to that thread, if you're gripped by how the mighty fall, do yourself a favour. Subscribe, so you don't miss how the giants fall. Because we've told the stories of banks, of airlines, of empires of business that all believed the exact same thing Rangers believed, that they were simply too big to die. Hit that button, then come straight back, because this is the moment it all came apart. In June 2012, the creditors voted, and the biggest creditor of all, HMRC, the taxman, owed tens of millions, said no. No deal, no mercy, no lifeline, And with that single word, the company that had been Rangers Football Club since 1872 was finished. Take a breath and feel the weight of that. 140 years. Every title, every cup, every European night under the lights. Every father who lifted a child onto his shoulders to see over the crowd. Every old man who'd asked to have his ashes scattered on that pitch. Every teenager who fell in love with the game in that stadium and never fell out of it. All of it, the whole cathedral of memory, reduced in a lawyer's ledger to a company being wound up, to be liquidated, its assets sold, its corporate body shut down forever. Sit with how surreal that morning was. The sun still came up over Ibrox. The stadium still stood, silent and enormous. The badge still meant everything to the people who loved it. But the thing that had signed every contract and lifted every trophy since Queen Victoria sat on the throne, the legal heart of the club, had simply stopped beating, and there was no bringing it back. Somewhere in an office the paperwork was signed. No final whistle, no last goal, no crowd to say goodbye. 140 years didn't end with a roar. It ended with the quiet scratch of a pen. And that, somehow, was the cruelest part of all, that something so loud, so alive, so central to the lives of millions, could die in total silence. To keep football alive at Ibrox at all, a brand new company had to be born and buy up the corpse. The ground, the training kit, the very name itself. A new consortium, led by a businessman named Charles Green, stepped in to do exactly that. The stadium would have a team again. But the club that walked out of the tunnel next season would carry a wound that no trophy could ever quite close. The knowledge that it had already died once, and that forever had turned out to have an expiry date. A new company means a new club in the eyes of the leagues, and that new company could not simply inherit Rangers' place at the top of Scottish football. The other clubs, the ones who'd watched Rangers spend and win, voted, and they sent the giant not down one division, not two, but all the way to the bottom. The fourth tier, the Scottish Third Division. Amateurs and part-timers and tiny grounds that had never in their wildest dreams expected to host a club this size. Imagine it, one season. Rangers are among the biggest names in the Scottish game. The next, they're kicking off away at Peterhead, at Annan, at Montrose villages and small towns, on pitches a fraction the size of Ibrox. The giant, forced to start again from nothing, at the very bottom of the ladder it had once towered over. And here's the cruelest twist of all. Remember the big tax case? The scheme that started this whole tragedy? For years, nobody could even agree whether it had been illegal at all. In late 2012, a tax tribunal actually ruled largely in Rangers' favour, suggesting the scheme might have been legitimate after all. Imagine being a fan, having watched your club die, only to hear that the very thing that killed it might not have been a crime. But HMRC would not let go. They appealed, and appealed. Higher and higher, court after court, year after year, a legal war that dragged on for half a decade. And finally, in July 2017, it reached the highest court in the United Kingdom, the Supreme Court. And there at last the judges ruled. HMRC were right. The payments should have been taxed as earnings. The scheme in the eyes of the country's highest court did not work. 5 years after the club died, the argument that started it all was finally settled, long after there was anything left to save. So what does the death of Rangers actually teach us? It teaches us that no institution is too old to die. Not 140 years, not 200, not 1,000. Age is not armour, size is not a shield. A club adored by millions can be undone by a decision made quietly in a boardroom by people who were absolutely certain they'd outsmart the system. Because that's the real lesson buried in the wreckage. Rangers didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they thought they were invincible. The scheme that ruined them wasn't forced upon them. It was chosen, reached for. A shortcut to glory that let them buy a golden age on credit. And the bill for a golden age bought on credit always comes due. The trophies of those years still sit in the cabinet. But now there's a shadow over every one of them. A whispered question about what they really cost and who really paid. The players moved on. The owners moved on. But the fans, the fathers and sons and daughters who had nothing to do with any trust or any loophole, they were the ones left standing in the rubble, watching their forever club start again from the bottom. Rangers survive today, the new company slowly climbing back up through the divisions over the years that followed, refusing to disappear. But something was lost in 2012 that no promotion can ever fully return. A certain innocence, a certain faith, the unshakable belief that some things simply cannot end. Because here's the truth that Rangers learned the hardest way there is. The giants never think they're falling. Right up until the moment they hit the ground, They're still convinced they're too big to fall, and that is exactly how they go bust.